I feel a little bit like a broken record here, and that's because for the last year and a half or so, all of these conversations we've been having have been focused around COVID, and today's is going to be no different in that regard, especially as some of the variants, this Delta variant seems to be rearing its ugly head. You remember back when the vaccine news started to come out and the vaccine news was good. What we talked about a lot was reshaping the portfolios to take advantage of reopening stocks. And the reopening stocks are the types of companies that would benefit from people's willingness to travel, people's willingness to go to restaurants, the simple ability to go to work, get kids into childcare, things of that nature. Another big element of this had to do with the fact that the government has modeled a lot of its stimulus efforts around these types of events as well. What's the likelihood that the economies will be slowing down because of COVID? What's the likelihood that we're going to be coming out of it with vaccines? So all those things have a bearing on the financial markets, obviously. So as things did start to improve, we allocated funds to these reopening stocks and away from defensive companies, and that turned out to be a pretty good decision. Now, however, we find ourselves in what at this point, I guess we're expecting is sort of a halftime or an intermission. But what we're seeing is that the Delta variant and quite frankly, the threats of inflation, that's another thing that you see in the news a lot lately. But these are creating some drag on the financial market and potentially creating some risks that the spike in growth is behind us and that the trend in growth will begin to decay. We see that in confidence surveys. There are several confidence surveys have shown that since June, consumer confidence has been coming down a little bit, not a lot, but again, that the peak might be behind us. Asset class performance is demonstrating this to some extent, market breadth to some extent. But I don't want you to think that this is somehow we're forecasting bad news, because I think before we jump to any conclusions, we have to address the fact that this could really just be short-term noise. You have to remember that in the United States and in most other big countries now, we're enjoying relatively high vaccination rates, and we have very effective vaccines. So even though people might be getting sick, they're staying out of the hospital, and obviously the mortality numbers are way down. And one maybe upside of some of this activity could be a refocus, or having those who are not yet vaccinated think about this again in order to help protect themselves and their families. And of course, the more of that we get, the closer we're going to be to that herd immunity that the doctors have talked so much about. So the reality here is it's very possible that we just might be in the process, and I hate this term because it's been used and used and used and overused, but we might be approaching sort of a new normal where we are watching the world adjust to what a post-pandemic or post-crisis world would be, where we're simply living with the COVID virus. We're keeping it in check with vaccines and potentially booster shots and things of that nature. And we're just going to go about living our lives. But the thing is, this is going to be a herky-jerky process as we get there. But the odds are that's probably what's happening. There's an article in the paper in the Wall Street Journal today that talks about the fact that England has decided, Boris Johnson has decided that that's the experiment they're going to run. They're basically telling people to go live their lives individually. People should decide if they want to go to big gatherings or not, if they want to wear masks or not. They're seeing about 50,000 new cases per day. but their hospitalizations are very low. I think Doug is going to address this in just a few minutes. So these are evolving issues, and I think that the reality is we're never going to know a final answer here, because this, again, it's going to be something that's sort of constantly developing. At HCM, our goal is to understand the cycle and position ourselves accordingly. So again, thinking about, we're going through a phase where we're in the reopening phase, and so we want to lean in that direction. Now, if we're in an intermission phase or a halftime phase, while we're going to see if we can, if the vaccines can keep this new variant in check, that's going to require some adjustments. Then presumably we'll go through and get back into the reopening phase again. So that idea of being in sync with the cycles is really where our focus is. So with that said, those are sort of my opening comments. So Doug, where are we going from here?
Well, I think if for the movie buffs on here, they can notice the DeLorean on the screen, relate that to the movie Back to the Future. And I think, one of the underlying themes of this presentation is, are we going back in time? Are we going back in time with COVID? Are we going back in time with economic growth? Are we going back in time with the leadership from the market? And really, when we say go back in time, we're not going back to 1984, 1985, or whatever year they went back to. We're talking about just going back to 2020, because the environment that we saw for a good portion of 2020 was very different than the one that we saw for the beginning of this year. And you mentioned the reflation theme, and that's something I think we've talked about quite a bit over the last, I'd say 6 to 8 months. And now I think we're seeing things in the market that are maybe giving us a little bit of pause there and saying, okay, is this in fact, as you mentioned, an intermission, or are we starting to get into this time machine and go back to what we saw last year?